biblical tales. God floods the earth, sparing Noah, his family, and 2 of every animal on board his ark.
Noah's family tree was the blueprint for humanity, but ancient scrolls show a jagged tear where a 4th name once lived. We have been taught about Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Yet in Genesis chapter 9, verse 25, a bizarre curse hits Canaan, Noah's grandson, who is treated like a sibling to hide a missing son. Ancient Syriac texts describe this 4th son as a bloodline that the flood was specifically designed to purge. But who was this ghost? Erased from Genesis. The moment the floodwaters receded, the Bible gave us this image of a fresh start. But something was fundamentally broken from the very first harvest. If you open to Genesis chapter 9, verses 18 through 27, you'll find one of the most confusing and arguably manipulated passages in ancient history. Noah gets drunk in his vineyard. His son Ham sees him uncovered. And then the text takes a bizarre, illogical turn. Instead of Noah punishing Ham for whatever happened in that tent, he wakes up and puts a soul-crushing curse on his grandson, Canaan. He screams that Canaan shall be a servant of servants to his uncles, Shem and Japheth. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The wording used in the original Hebrew treats Canaan as if he were Noah's direct sibling or peer, not a child 2 generations down. It is a massive textual glitch that suggests a specific name was scrubbed out and replaced with grandson to make the math work. According to the research papers from Aish HaTorah, a Jewish education network, many rabbinic scholars have wrestled with why the curse skipped the perpetrator and hit a child. The pure seed narrative required Noah's 3 famous sons to be the perfect restart for humanity, entirely untainted by the chaos of the old world. But Genesis chapter 6 verse 4 reminds us that the Nephilim, the giants, were on the earth before the flood, and also after that. If the flood was supposed to be a total reset, how did that giant DNA survive? Some ancient commentators whisper that there was a 4th son who carried the genetic markers of those giants, a literal black sheep, whose existence threatened the entire story of a clean, holy beginning. By editing the text to curse Canaan instead of this unnamed 4th brother, the scribes could explain away the later wars with the Canaanites, while burying the truth of a genetic survivor. Think about that for a second. If the goal was to convince the world that the giant problem was solved by the water, you couldn't have a 4th son of Noah walking around with that bloodline. Some historians believe the sin in the vineyard wasn't just about nakedness, but a desperate failed attempt at a genetic purge that Noah realized too late had already failed. But if the Bible tried to erase him, the other side of the world remembered him perfectly. Ancient texts outside the traditional canon actually give this ghost son a name and a tragic ending that changes everything we know about the ark. But who was this ghost son really? The 4th son revealed. The Bible tells us that only 8 people survived the flood, a perfect little number that suggests humanity was completely reset. But if you look over at the Quran, specifically in Surah 11, verses 42 and 43, the scene is much more chaotic and heartbreaking. As the waves are literally rising like mountains, Noah spots a 4th son standing apart from his brothers, and he screams out to him, "O my son, board with us and be not with the disbelievers." This son, often identified in Islamic scholarship as Yam or Canaan, doesn't just ignore his father. He looks at the water and essentially says he'll take his chances on a high mountain because he believes the earth can't possibly be entirely consumed. It's a moment of raw human defiance that ended with a wave sweeping him away while his father watched. Now, you've got to ask yourself why 2 major world religions, the Quran and various rabbinic texts like the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, both describe this tragic 4th figure, despite him being scrubbed from the main narrative in Genesis. The thing is, the official version needs you to believe the giant bloodline died in that water, but these ancient texts suggest the 4th son was the actual father of the giants, making him a progenitor who carried the very DNA the flood was supposed to erase. According to the Wikishare Digital Encyclopedia, which provides a detailed breakdown of these genealogies, this fourth son represents a massive problem for the pure lineage theory. If Noah were perfect in his generations, having a son who carried Nephilim traits or refused the ark entirely would create a massive hole in the story of a successful divine purge. And get this, the rabbinic details found in the Aish archives suggest that when Ham saw the nakedness of his father, it might have been a cover for a much deeper conflict regarding this fourth son's birth and his right to the earth. Think about that for a second. We have the Quran and the Bible, two faiths that don't always agree, both pointing to the exact same erased person who existed right at the edge of the flood. What do you think scribes were trying to hide by making the Quran and Bible agree on a son that officially doesn't exist in the family tree? It feels like they were trying to delete a branch of the family that didn't fit the New World Order. The prevailing theory among researchers who study these textual layers is that this son wasn't just a rebel. He was the survival point for the giants, a literal bridge of DNA that made it through the storm even if he didn't make it onto the boat. The texts say he drowned, leaving Noah with only 3 righteous heirs to repopulate the planet. But here is where the story takes a turn into the truly undeniable. He drowned in the story, but did his bloodline somehow cling on to the post-flood world? Giants, flood survival. The giants knew the flood was coming long before the first drop of rain even hit the soil, and they weren't planning on going quietly into the deep. If you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a specific collection of fragments known as the Book of Giants that describes a series of terrifying dreams that began to haunt the Nephilim. In one of these visions, a giant named Hahya sees a massive tablet being submerged in a great body of water, and as it slowly rises back to the surface, all the names on it have been wiped clean except for 3. It was a literal divine hit list, a warning that the world was about to be scrubbed of its existence. But here is where the story gets incredibly dark. While the traditional version of history tells us the flood was a total reset, various ancient traditions suggest that the giants actually outsmarted the reset by finding a way to stay above the surface. Now, here is where it gets interesting because we have the story of Og, the king of Bashan, who shows up in Jewish midrashic texts, like those preserved by the scholars at Mayim Akronim. According to these accounts, Og didn't get a room inside the ark, but he was far too massive to drown easily, so he actually hitched a ride on the outside of the vessel. He supposedly sat on a ladder attached to the hull or clung to the roof, and Noah had to pass him food through a small hatch every single day, just to keep him from pulling the whole ship down. It sounds like a total myth, until you realize that the Bible itself drops a detail that is way too specific to be mere campfire folklore. In Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 11, the text describes Og's bedstead, noting it was made of solid iron and measured 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. When you convert those ancient measurements, you are looking at a 13.5-foot bed, which is exactly the kind of furniture you'd need for a survivor of a giant bloodline. Think about that for a second. If the flood was a perfect purge, why do we see the Nephilim appearing again in the land of Canaan just a few generations later? When the Hebrew spies went into the land in Numbers chapter 13, verse 33, they didn't just report seeing tall people. They explicitly stated they saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, and that they felt like tiny grasshoppers by comparison. This means the flood was either incomplete or the giants found a biological loophole, perhaps through the wives of Noah's sons, or the hidden lineage of that forbidden fourth son we talked about earlier. Could a giant really hitch a ride on the ark? Or was the bloodline simply too resilient to be drowned out by a single storm? The research from Bible archaeology points to the Rephaim as a very real historical tribe of massive stature that continued to exist long after the water receded. It tells us that the giants didn't just die out, they clung to the edges of the New World, surviving through sheer force of will or by hiding within the very families meant to replace them. Now, here's the thing. If they survived, it means the purge wasn't a total wipe. It was a targeted war that they somehow managed to survive. This bloodline was cursed to serve, but why were the giants, the ones the ancient scribes were so terrified of, that they tried to write them out of the story entirely? Curse hides the bloodline. When you really start to look at the aftermath of the flood, you realize that the world wasn't just recovering from a disaster, it was entering a state of high-stakes genetic damage control. We've established that the giants somehow managed to linger, but the real mystery is why the Bible uses such specific, aggressive language to keep them under thumb. If you look at Genesis chapter 9, verses 25 through 27, Noah's curse isn't just a father being angry at a son. It's a formal, legalistic decree of servitude. He says, "Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren." Now, here's the thing that gets people fired up. Researchers like those at Prophetic Revelation suggest that this curse wasn't about a simple mistake in a tent, but was actually a desperate move to contain the Nephilim traits that had resurfaced in Ham's line. By forcing this specific lineage into servant status, the post-flood authorities were trying to create a social cage for a bloodline they couldn't entirely kill off. Now, here's where it gets interesting, and honestly, a bit unsettling. When you track the descendants of this cursed line, you find yourself staring directly at the Rephaim, the Anakim, and the inhabitants of Bashan, the very giants that the Israelites were later ordered to completely wipe out during the conquest of Canaan. It wasn't just a random land dispute. According to the theological insights from Knowing Scripture, a group dedicated to biblical theology, these later wars were actually the second half of the flood's mission. Think about that for a second. If the flood was a targeted strike that failed to get everyone, then the curse of Canaan was the manual for a biological purge that lasted for centuries. It suggests that the giants weren't just random monsters, they were Noah's own kin, the descendants of that hidden fourth son whose very existence made a mockery of the ark's pure mission.
And Noah went in, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him into the ark because of the waters of the flood.
You have to wonder if the knowledge of the Watchers, those fallen angels from the Book of Enoch, didn't just drown in the mud, but was actively whispered from father to son to keep the giant legacy alive. Was the curse really about giants' DNA? Or was it just a way to justify the total economic and social erasure of a people who were simply too physically powerful to control otherwise? Even the 2026 research updates from archaeological enthusiasts point toward this being a massive cover-up. They suggest that the servant label was a way to dehumanize a group that still carried the forbidden wisdom and height of the pre-flood world. It's an uncomfortable truth to swallow, but it looks like the post-flood giants weren't outsiders at all. They were part of the family, a jagged branch of Noah's own tree that someone tried to prune with a curse when the water failed to do the job. Now, here is where the story shifts from ancient ink to cold, hard stone. Because if this bloodline truly survived, we shouldn't just find mentions of them in dusty scrolls. We should see their fingerprints on the earth itself. And it turns out, we do. From the massive basalt structures in the Levant to the rock giants described in recent reports by the Biblical Archaeology Society, the physical evidence is screaming what the scribes tried to whisper away. It makes you realize that the clean start we were promised in Sunday school might have been the greatest PR campaign in human history. Does this ancient drama still echo today? Modern traces exposed. Everything we've discussed so far, the erased fourth son, the bizarre curse on the grandson, and the hitchhiking giant on the ark, all point to a physical reality that left massive, undeniable scars on the earth we can still see today.
As the waters receded back into the earth, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat.
If you look at the ground beneath our feet, the ground in the Levant especially, the ground is screaming a truth that the scribes tried to whisper away in the margins of Genesis. We spent 4 chapters talking about dusty scrolls and translation glitches, but the moment you step into the actual archaeology of the region, the story of the Forbidden Son stops being a theory and starts being a blueprint for survival. When you really stop to think about it, The reason we have these massive cyclopean ruins that nobody can quite explain is that the flood wasn't a total wipe. It was a targeted strike that ultimately missed its most dangerous targets. Let's talk about the iron bed of Og for a second, because this is where the Bible stops being poetic and starts acting like a property appraiser. In Deuteronomy, chapter 3, verse 11, the text casually mentions that Og, the king of Bashan, had a bedstead made of iron that was 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. Now, if you do the math, and it's important to actually visualize this, you're looking at a 13.5-foot bed. Think about that for a second. Why would a historical record need to specify the material and the exact dimensions of a bed unless that object was a trophy of a war against a different species?
The biblical account reveals that before the flood, spreading terror, corruption, and violence across the planet.
According to the researchers at Mayim Acronym, who specialize in these midrashic traditions, the people of Bashan weren't just tall. They were a distinct race of Rephaim who built cities out of massive basalt rock that seemed entirely impossible for normal men to move. Now, wait. It gets even weirder because this isn't just ancient lore. According to the 2025 and early 2026 updates from the Biblical Archaeology Society regarding rock giants in the Golan Heights, archaeologists have been documenting these massive basalt structures that align perfectly with the dimensions found in the ancient scrolls. They found these megalithic tombs and walls that were built with stones so heavy that modern cranes would struggle with them, and yet they date back to the very era when the giants were supposedly already extinct. This makes it almost entirely impossible to dismiss these stories as mere folklore when the physical evidence is staring us in the face. It reveals that the giant problem wasn't solved by the water, it was only hidden by it for a while. Now, here's the thing that really flips the script.
In the center of all the circles, there is a large heap of stones, about 13 feet high.
When the Hebrew spies went into the land of Canaan in Numbers chapter 13, verse 33, they didn't just see a few tall guys standing on a hill. They reported seeing the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, and they were so terrified they claimed they felt like tiny grasshoppers in comparison. This wasn't just a story about height. It was a report on the survival of a bloodline that was supposed to be extinct according to the pure seed narrative Noah was meant to represent. By weaving together the Quranic accounts of the fourth son, Yam, who refused the ark and stayed on the mountain, and the biblical glitch of the cursed Canaan, we start to see a consistent pattern across multiple faiths. They were all describing the same thing, a genetic bridge that spanned the flood. Think about the implications of that for a moment. If these giants were Noah's own kin, the descendants of a son like Yam, or the result of genetic markers carried through Ham's wife, then the curse of Canaan was actually a manual for a biological purge that lasted for centuries. It suggests that the giants weren't just random monsters, they were part of the family, a jagged branch of Noah's own tree that someone tried to prune with a curse when the water failed to do the job. The research from Bible archaeology points to the Rephaim as a very real, historical tribe that continued to exist long after the water receded, proving that the giants didn't just die out, they clung to the edges of the new world. Every time a new basalt bed is uncovered, or a massive iron tool is found, the story of the forbidden fourth son becomes harder to ignore. The truth changes everything we thought we knew about Genesis, because it suggests the flood wasn't just a storm. It was a war for the future of human DNA, a war that the giants actually survived by outsmarting the reset. They walked the post-flood Earth, and their bones, their beds, and their massive cities remain as a silent testimony to a history that was almost erased. Does this ancient drama still echo today? The evidence is literally carved into the rocks, and it tells us that the giants weren't just myth, they were the survivors of a purge that was meant to end them forever. The erased fourth son and the giant bloodline prove the flood narrative was only a half-truth. Scribes tried to bury the names, but the 13-foot beds of Og reveal a secret history of survival. Was the fourth son's ancestry real or a myth? Drop your thoughts in the comments.